Rocking the Kremlin is a new book by David Junk and Fred Bronson, and it chronicles the true story of Universal Music Russia's first CEO and his quest to bring Western popular music to post-Soviet Russia. There was no proper music industry in the USSR, and in the post-Soviet era, David Junk assembled a team of young and talented Russians, building a record company amidst political chaos, organized crime, powerful oligarchs, bombings, and violence. He also developed local talents such as Alsou and t.A.T.u, Russia's greatest selling pop act of all time, alongside bringing major artists over to Moscow. But when Vladimir Putin took over, everything started to change. This is a fascinating story of what it was like to work in what became known as the Wild, Wild East.
I knew a few people that got killed in Russia. It didn't scare me. My Russian staff, my young staff were pretty worried about this because, if you mess up, you might disappear. The honors of being the leader of the group to fight piracy is you have to go out on these police raids and fight piracy. So I'd be strapping on bulletproof vests and helmets and going on raids of pirate factories. This is pure provocation. And that's what t.A.T.u was. That's what the project was. It was meant to provoke. Father was happy with me. He didn't make me disappear. The manager who put it all together, we write about it. He reminded me of Malcolm McLaren from the Sex Pistols, just provoke, provoke, provoke.
Stick with me for that interview. Just time to ask you to like, subscribe, but above all, please take out a membership to help me continue with this podcast. Well, first of all, David Junk and Fred Bronson, welcome. Well, David, you are the person this story is about, and the subtitle is My Incredible True Story of Gangsters, Oligarchs, and Pop Stars in Putin's Russia. And the book is called Rocking the Kremlin. It's a great read. Millions of twists and turns. And to be honest, it took me back as well to times when I was at MTV, where I had been to Russia. And I did meet Boris, actually, as well. But we come to that later. And we come to the wild East, as you've called it, and it certainly was. So, but first of all, I want to start a little bit with your background, David, because we lived through the Cold War, and there were certain events in your youth which colored your view of the then Soviet Union. Can you tell me about them?
Well, yes, and thank you for inviting us on the show. It's a real pleasure to be talking with you today, especially a colleague from the music industry. That's a real special honor and treat for us. I grew up on a farm in Ohio during the 70s and into the 80s, Ronald Reagan's America, and I grew up in the context of potential nuclear Armageddon just around the corner. The tensions were never higher between the United States and the Soviet Union then, right around the time when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan in 1979, and then President Jimmy Carter boycotted the Summer Olympics in Moscow, and there was a grain embargo, which affected people like me, our family farm, because we were selling a lot of wheat to the Russians before that. But that grain embargo hurt us. So I always feared a potential Soviet attack. We had a major Air Force base called Wright-Patterson. It's real famous, one of the most important ones for the U.S. military. Just 30 minutes away. So clearly that was going to be a target for a first strike. We knew that, and I knew that, and so I never dreamed that I would end up moving to Russia, living there, marrying a Russian. It just it never was in the cards at all at that point in my childhood. But that's what I ended up doing.
One of the interesting things that you talked about is that your career at first seemed to be moving into politics in some way,
Yes.
And then there was a trigger, which was this Roger Waters' The Wall concert, which I attended as well. And
Oh, is that
actually,
right?
yeah, and
Wow.
actually interviewed everyone there. So that was also something which connects us.
Yeah.
Now,
Incredible.
I went because of work, you know. I went to interview the people there and to report for MTV Europe. You went because you were a fan and
I
you
was
wanted to go
crazy.
and see this concert. So tell me about it.
Well, I was the kid in high school that was the Pink Floyd fan, more than anybody. I just loved that band and had all their albums and was, really disappointed when the Wall concert that they staged in 1980 only came to Los Angeles, the Forum, and Madison Square Garden in New York. And then only in London was the only other venue for that. It was too big, apparently, to take on the road. So you had to go to those major cities. And I was a freshman in high school. There's no way my mom was going to let me travel to LA or New York to see Pink Floyd, And especially that song, Another Brick in the Wall, was really disliked by our school teachers at the time, too. So that it was not the most popular band amongst parents at that point. So when the band broke up and Roger Waters one time was asked, and he answered facetiously, when are you going to get the band back together? He says, well, when the Berlin Wall comes down, and so, that was not ever going to happen in his mind. But when the Berlin Wall did come down, he did agree to stage the Wall concert there at Potsdamer Platz, where you were, and the former no man's land, where many perished trying to escape to freedom. And so it was, me going backpacking to East Berlin, staying in a youth hostel, being amongst 500,000 Germans and Eastern Europeans and a few foreigners, very few, but a few Americans. And freedom was breaking out, and it was so contagious. And I was just so overwhelmed by this feeling. And I was talking with young Eastern European students asking me about, what's democracy going to be like? What's capitalism? What is supply and demand? All these questions. And someone finally said to me, you should come back over here and help us transition from communism to capitalism. And eureka, that was a life-changing moment for me.
I
And
mean,
that's what
it was the promise of a new world, wasn't it, back then? It was something that really felt like, as opposed to how we feel today. I think that's something, we had back then was like, oh, things are going to constantly get better. Things are going to constantly change. And you mentioned you met a couple of students. I think they must be the ones that you went to Prague with.
Yes, exactly.
And that's where you found your calling, as it were. Tell me, what did you feel your calling was at that point?
Well, I was actually enrolled in law school back in America, in Ohio, and I was going towards politics because, that's just what you do, right? And when I went to Prague and talked with those students about the promise of the future and freedom and democracy and capitalism, I just knew that my calling was to come back and help them because I do have know-how. I understood capitalism, business. I working on a farm. I learned how to manage. I became a man. I learned how to manage other people and in the importance of supply and demand. So I was ready for this. And, the fact that it would be someday music, I had no idea. But all I was focused on was just helping Eastern Europeans transition to capitalism and bury their communist past.
Okay, Fred, I want to come to you because obviously your part of your journey is actually meeting David, and it's also connected closely to music. And
Yes.
in a sort of odd way, I mean, tomorrow night I'm going to the EBU, the Eurovision event in Greece. I live in Athens now.
Oh,
So,
that's
and you're a Eurovision fan. So
I am.
tell me the journey to actually meeting David before
Sure.
you actually got to the point of being co-author on this book.
Oh yeah, it was years earlier. So I started covering Eurovision for Billboard in 1995 in person and kept going. So in the year 2000, it was in Stockholm, Sweden having won the year before. And I'm there, and the artist from Russia is a teenage girl, Alsou, who is signed to Universal Music Russia. And I meet the CEO of Universal Music Russia, David Junk. And we just hit it off. We became, I think, immediate friends, stayed in touch for quite a few years. David came back to Eurovision later, as you know, with t.A.T.u. So we saw each other. And I think we were in touch for maybe 10, 15 years, and then sort of lost touch, not on purpose, but, it happened. And in 2022, Billboard asked me to do a really in-depth piece on the history of Ukraine and Russia in Eurovision, the politics, the rivalry, and I did a lot of interviews for it. And I thought, I've got to find David because he went to Eurovision for Russia. He's going to have great things to say. And I had an email from 10 years earlier, and I wrote, and he replied right away. We did the interview. He gave me great quotes for that and said, next time you're in LA, let's have dinner and we'll talk. And over dinner, he said, among many other things, I want to write a book about my time in Russia. So I said, do you have a publisher? No. Would you like me to ask my publisher? Yes. So I called my editor. I tell him about David and the book. And his reaction was, I want that book. That is exactly the kind of book we want to publish. So I go back to David. Good news. My publisher wants your book. He said, oh, would you write it? And I said, yeah, I'd love to. That's how the collaboration started. It's David's story, and I was honored to write it.
Just take me back to that Eurovision
Yes.
moment in Sweden, because was that the evening that Simon Napier-Bell was with you as well?
Simon was there.
Well, I love Simon. He's just brilliant. And I remember having an evening in Hamburg where we were at the bar, and for the whole evening. And of course, Simon told me all the stories. It's just brilliant. So what did you learn that evening that you didn't know before?
Oh, interesting. Well, I knew about Simon. I knew he had written the English lyrics to "You Don't Have to Say You Love Me." I knew that he was involved with Wham. But I had never met the guy in person. He's such a big, bold personality, and they were friends. They're friends to this day, and I don't know. So we're working together because, as you know, he brought Simon in to manage Alsou, and later the Russian boy band Smash. So I was just blown away by Simon's incredible personality.
Yeah, he's larger than life, isn't he? Okay, David, I want to move back to you because what was interesting is your connection to Russia was through diamonds. It wasn't initially through music. So what was this connection, and how did it go from diamonds to music?
Oh, it was, we call it a strange path, and it was a very strange path. I was living in San Francisco. There's that lyric in the Grateful Dead song, "What a strange trip it's been." I was definitely on a strange trip. I had moved to San Francisco to get an MBA. After I returned from Berlin, after I returned from the Roger Waters concert, and was determined to help Eastern Europeans, I knew I needed a business degree. And I wanted to learn some Russian because Russian was, well, frankly, everybody in Eastern Europe spoke Russian because they had to. They were forced to learn that in the school. So like English is in the Western world, Russian is in that part of the world. So I learned Russian and got a business degree on the side. And I was living in San Francisco, finishing my studies, and I started sending resumes out to accounting firms in Moscow, and one of those firms sent it back to their San Francisco office, an accounting firm called KPMG. It's one of these big worldwide accounting firms. And they had just signed up a brand new joint venture, American-Russian joint venture called Golden ADA. It was a diamond company, and it had just purchased a factory in San Francisco, and it was going to compete with the worldwide diamond cartel De Beers. which was crazy, right? And just exciting. And they were looking for Americans. They were looking for, in particular, American accountants. And I just happened to be an American accountant who spoke a little bit of Russian. So I got hired immediately. They put me in charge of their Russian office. They sent me to Moscow. It was the greatest job until I realized this is an entire sham. The entire thing was a sham. It was set up by Boris Yeltsin and other figures in the Kremlin using local gangsters, basically, to put it together. And they stole over $200 million in diamonds from the Russian treasury. I mean, it was called the greatest looting of Mother Russia in the post-Cold War era. And I was a part of it. But I had no idea. No idea. And I was in Moscow, and the IRS and the FBI finally raided our factory there in San Francisco and shut us down. I always like to say, just like they never put Al Capone away for murder, but avoiding taxes, and that's exactly what the Russians did. They didn't pay taxes on those stolen diamonds. So, IRS moved in and took it over. And I was under investigation in Russia because I was the only person that the Russians could latch onto. I was living there. And so I wasn't allowed to leave the country, and I was investigated for more than a year. Meanwhile, I'm trying to get a new career going with PolyGram. So I'm not telling Boris or my new bosses at PolyGram that I'm under investigation for the theft of $200 million in Russian diamonds. And I tried to keep it secret. And actually, it was this book the first time I really talked about it.
So there you are. You're under investigation for the theft of $200 million worth of diamonds. I love this. And then this job comes up at PolyGram that you don't know, but no one else wants.
Right. And I was sitting in my kitchen there in Moscow, trying to figure out what to do. I had gotten a job offer from Heinz Ketchup, and I really wasn't really excited about that, but I had to do something just to get away from the diamonds, right? And I saw this help wanted ad in the Moscow Times looking for a financial accountant for a Western multinational record label that was just opening up in Russia. And so I sent my resume off, and the next day they called and flew me to London to interview. They were so desperate for someone. And when they found out an American happened to be living in Moscow with an accounting degree, I was hired. I was hired so fast, and I got paid more money than I ever got paid in my life. And it was just the beginning of a whole new journey, in the music industry. So much more glamorous and exciting than anything I could ever have imagined. And it was only because I was at the right place at the right time.
You say glamorous and exciting, but in that contract were quite a few very unusual clauses, weren't there?
Yes. Well, it is Russia, high risk zone, as they call it, right up there with North Korea and Iran. You get hazard pay, and you also get they take out a kidnapping insurance policy on anyone they put in a territory like that. So I had a $6 million kidnapping policy on me, and that's no joke. They really were kidnapping executives in Russia at that time. You may recall, there were several ended up dead or in buried deep in these pits called zindans. We talk about that in the book. And so it was a real possibility, but I was in Moscow, so I didn't really take it seriously. I was probably naive, though. It was probably more dangerous than I realized.
Fred, did you have any idea, and I want to come to David again about what it was really like when you were there, but did you have any idea of this wild, wild East? Because I'd been there in the late 80s. I went with and reported there. I went to St. Petersburg and with a really big manager, I won't say, with an absolute world star at the time. And there were some real weird things going on there. And I went with the Pet Shop Boys in 94. And when we filmed they filmed in Red Square, and we covered all that. And they had Brezhnev's limo, which had gold door handles. Absolute solid gold door handles. Right. And we had to have a guy with a gun looking after us. And we went to a club and there were 14 people with Uzis on the front door. I mean, it was the most wildest thing I'd ever seen. Did you realize, Fred, how sort of crazy this period, I don't know what it's like today, obviously it's a very different world, but how crazy this period was in Russia?
Not until David told me about it. No, I did not. I unfortunately, I'd never been to Russia. Now I'm not going to go, and I should have gone when I could have gone, and I didn't, which I regret. So no, this was a lot of information that was new to me. Not that I was necessarily surprised by it, being aware of the culture and all of that, but no, I didn't really know.
So there you are, David. You're at the PolyGram office, and this is where you're meeting people like Bill Rohde, my former boss at MTV. You're working with Boris Zozimov. Is that how you pronounce it? I think that's it. Exactly. Yeah. You're working with Boris, and you're sort of finding out, I presume, although you probably knew bits of it, but you are finding out about the culture and how it really operates in Russia. So how scary and mind-blowing was it to suddenly be in this melting pot of criminality, which a lot of it is?
I was probably unaware of how dangerous the situation was because I was just so overwhelmed with excitement for this job and excitement to be in this city. Moscow is dangerous and dirty and polluted and and just lots of negative things. But I was there and I knew it was historical. You could feel the history was being made. Presidents would fly in. It was constantly this, and especially in the 90s when I was there, there was this period of love between the United States and Russia. We were coming together. When Clinton flew in and met Yeltsin and all the time that they spent together, there was a sense of hope. So you put the car bombings behind you, you overlook the assassinations here and there. I knew a few people that got killed in Russia personally, but I still plowed on through because I really was excited about what we were doing, and perhaps I thought, I'm an American. Why are they going to kill me? I mean, it's pointless to go after me. There's so many other things the gangsters can do than take me out, and so I guess I just accepted it and rolled with it, and sort of what doesn't kill you makes you stronger kind of attitude about it.
I mean, what's fascinating is the music industry and how it was pre this opening up. The Berlin Wall falls down, and then you have Gorbachev and this whole opening up. And there was basically one record company, and it was sort of a propaganda machine in a lot of aspects, wasn't it? To only have sort of nice music that the government wanted for the well, at that point, for the Soviet people. And then when it was Russia, things started to change. So what did you see as your goal, and what did Boris want from you to achieve at PolyGram?
And the Mafia and the corrupt.
Maybe explain the pirates, because I remember that. I mean, it was such a huge problem.
Yeah,
pirating of music. It was an industry.
Exactly. I say when I got there, the Russian mafia controlled the music market, not the record labels. And 9 out of every 10 CDs pressed in Russia was illegal, counterfeit. And it was not just Universal's artists like Elton John, Bon Jovi, but also even Russian artists were being ripped off by the mafia. And this mafia, they would use the proceeds from selling counterfeit CDs to fund all kinds of other terrible things like sex trafficking, drug trafficking, weapons trafficking. We uncovered all of that. And the Kremlin wouldn't do anything about it. In fact, there were corrupt military generals who allowed these factories, these CD replication plants, to be located on military bases. So whenever we would try to raid them with Moscow police, we would be turned away by the military police. You know, it was a battle, so Mexican standoff. You know, and we lost. You know, so you know, it was tough, and frankly, I gave up trying to be tough and go head on with the pirates, and I decided to try a diplomatic approach, and I went to the highest ranking American in Russia, the U.S. ambassador, and I pleaded with him to help the music industry fight the pirates by putting pressure on the Kremlin to close them down. And what he did, and it's really incredible, is he spoke with President George W. Bush at the time and persuaded him to block Russia from entering the World Trade Organization. At that moment, Russia really badly wanted in to the WTO for all kinds of reasons, tariff relief, just, you know, it was trying to develop as a real economy so more investors would come to Russia. And they wanted to join the WTO, but we blocked it until they started closing down those pirate factories, and that's what really worked. But I'm sure I pissed off the Kremlin by doing that. I'm absolutely certain of that.
So I want to get to Alsou because this is, you know, one of the connections between you. But before you talk about how you found Alsou and the development, Fred, could you tell me the importance of Eurovision? Because for certain countries in Europe, it means nothing. For Britain, it's treated as a bit of a joke.
That's Terry Wogan's fault.
But for many countries, it's a form of national pride. It's
Yes.
an incredibly important competition, and it may not just be about music. So could you just sort of enlighten us?
Sure. Well, you're absolutely right about that. The countries like Sweden take it very seriously, and Malta. It's a huge source of national pride in Malta, and also good for tourism, because a lot of people may not have heard of Malta until they watched the Eurovision Song Contest. So, you know, it started, as you know, in 1956 as a way to bring the countries of Europe together after, you know, a decade after World War II. And it just became bigger and bigger. There were only 6 countries in back then. Now, you know, it's up to 43 countries competing. So big that, you know, they have to have semifinals and a grand final. And it's literally become a bigger show than ever because it's seen worldwide. You know, Australia is, you know, a huge fan of Eurovision, and he's even been invited in, even though they're not in the European Broadcasting Union. It's available to watch live in America now on the NBC's Peacock streaming service. You can watch it at 12 noon in Los Angeles, you know, 8 p.m. in the UK. And over the years, of course, it's produced artists like the most famous would be ABBA, of course, that was their way to become global stars, and it worked. I mean, that was their plan, to break out of the borders of Sweden. Celine Dion, when she was 19, won for Switzerland before she was, you know, a worldwide known singer. Cliff Richard was in, Olivia Newton-John was in, as you know, because you're British and you know who sung for Britain. But it's just become more of a massive event as the years have gone by. And in the last few years has actually produced artists, Maneskin from Italy, worldwide success for them, all because of Eurovision. And in the States, of course, now Will Ferrell did a movie about Eurovision, and more people know about it. So it's bigger than ever. It's established stars. Not everyone who goes in becomes a huge star. Not everyone has a hit record, but enough people do that it's very important.
So, David, there you are. You find this artist, Alsou, who is the daughter of an oligarch. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
So the oligarchs have immense power also creatively because they can bring their own family into the public eye. Obviously had talent, so I'm not, you know, trying to demean anything in that way. And your vision was to create an international success, and Eurovision was the platform. So tell me how you went about it and how it carried on after Eurovision. Before carrying on with the interview, I'd like you to consider liking, subscribing, and taking out a membership, particularly that, because it really does support me in continuing to bring these interviews to you, and everything helps. So please consider supporting me.
So I wanted to be taken seriously as a record executive, right? And I was the CEO of Universal, just starting off. Universal had purchased PolyGram by this time. This is 1999. We're talking about 1998, 1999. And I knew that I had to sell Bon Jovi and Elton John and Pavarotti and all the catalog of Universal. And I was able to do that. But I would never be taken seriously as a record executive if I didn't sign local talent and develop them, and even hopefully develop them for worldwide sales, right? And be able to promote them in other countries outside of Russia, because that's really when you have a superstar, is when you sign an artist like that. So I was super eager to do that. I was looking high and low everywhere for that star, and I didn't want to sign a rock band because I thought that would not work. I just didn't feel like a Russian rock band was ready to break through into the Europe or Asia. It just didn't feel right to me. I was thinking, who is the most popular Russian celebrity in the world at that time? This is 1998, 1999, right? Especially in America, where I'm from. And it was obvious. Anna Kournikova. It was the easiest answer. I mean, she wasn't winning a lot of championships, but she was extremely popular on the tennis circuit, and she was becoming mainstream. And I had seen her on the Jay Leno show, the Tonight Show with Jay Leno, talking about how much she loves America. She was just really endearing to us, and very beautiful and very young, and just the prototype new Russian, I thought. So I wanted to find the pop star version of Anna Kournikova. That was what was driving me, is I needed to find someone like that and make that person my first signing to Universal, because this was going to be historic. Whoever I signed was going to be the very first Russian artist ever signed to a Western record label. So it was a big deal. I knew we were going to make history, and I had to get it right, and it had to be special. So one evening I saw a video that Alsou, this artist, this young girl named Alsou, had made. It was a video called Winter's Dream. It's more like a movie than it was very well produced. You could tell hundreds of thousands of dollars went into this. Famous actors. It was quite well done, But the song was very beautiful. It was a ballad, and she was gorgeous, and she sang really sweetly. And I just thought to myself, if this girl can sing in English, I've got my superstar. And so I pursued signing her, not knowing a little secret about her that I didn't find out till the very last second. Her father is one of the wealthiest men in Russia. He's an oil oligarch. He owns a big portion of the Russian oil company Lukoil, which is everywhere in Europe, and one of the biggest oil companies, right up there with Chevron and Texaco and all those. And he's a tough guy. You don't become an oligarch, especially in the oil industry, by being gentle and sweet, right? So he was intimidating, and I didn't find out about him until right before the press conference, where we held a question and answer for the Russian media on my brand new artist, Alsou, and how historic this was. But I did it anyway, and it didn't scare me. My Russian staff, my young staff were pretty worried about this, because if you mess up, you might disappear. But I was convinced she's the one, and the very next step was take her international. And at the time, Eurovision was the best opportunity. Her father had figured out a way to make her the entry for this year's Eurovision contest. It was the year 2000 in Stockholm.
Oh, hang on a minute. He figured out a way.
He figured out a way. Yes, he figured out a way. He figured
What,
out
money?
But yeah, you know, there's ways in Russia to get things done. But you know, honestly, I have to say she was so talented that the money hurt her. It actually helped. It worked against her, because if she was some poor, broke, hungry girl from Moscow and no one ever knew about her father, and they just listened to her music and her talent. She's Dua Lipa 20 years too soon. I mean, I found Dua Lipa way too early in Moscow, and the record industry just wasn't ready at that time. You know, they were ready for Dua Lipa now, but but Alsou could have been that first breakthrough like Dua Lipa is around the world. And I'm convinced of that. She really was that talented. But Eurovision was there. We went. Simon Napier-Bell signed on as the manager, so we got the best of the best there. And no one knows how to make a star better than him. He would say, I don't want you, Alsou, walking out of the hotel, even to a convenience store, not looking like $1 million. Every time you're anywhere in public, you look more beautiful and more gorgeous and luxurious than everybody. And we had the backing vocalist for Pink Floyd, and we had the choreographers who worked for all kinds of UK artists, and we just put together a song by Steve Levine, who wrote for Culture Club and the Beach Boys. And we almost won. It was back and forth with these two old guys from Denmark, the Olsen brothers, who combined were 100 years in show business, and my girl was 16 years old, first time performing live too, and in bam, it's in front of 300 million TV audience. So I was so impressed with her, and she finished second. She should have won, but politics, the Scandinavian bloc all got together and beat us, but just by a hair. And she got invited to the Kremlin. Putin congratulated her, and it was a really big deal. And her father was happy with me. He didn't make me disappear.
Can I ask Fred something? Because you were there, you watched it. Did you feel you were watching an artist that could break internationally on that evening?
I did. I felt like she could have been the Russian Britney Spears or Christina Aguilera. She was in that, wheelhouse of pop female artist. And she had, the song was written by Americans, right? It was totally polished. She had the two dancers behind her. It was definitely a contender, and I felt she could be a breakthrough artist. But of course, some things happened and it didn't quite work out that way. Maybe David wants to tell how it all
tell about the Death Jam, because that's just such a brilliant line in the book.
But I was after Eurovision, you want to keep building on that success, and we were able to corral Enrique Iglesias into doing a duet with her in Moscow, which was really sweet and beautiful, and went to #1. It's still one of the biggest selling singles ever in Russia, and it's called "You're My #1," so that's fitting. But the real possibility of an American breakthrough came when I persuaded Lear Cohen, the founder of Def Jam Music in New York City, and one of the founding fathers of hip hop in general there in New York. Persuaded him to take a meeting with Alsou and come see her perform live at the Taj Mahal, and even Donald Trump arranged for a ballroom for us. So there you go. That's a crazy story from the early 2000s. But Lear was doing extremely well with Jay-Z at the time, hit #1 album after #1 album. He was going to soon be signing an artist called Rihanna, who we all know what happened to her. So it was obvious that if I could persuade him to sign Alsou, she was going to be a major breakthrough. And Lear's quote, I think we say it in the book, is he wanted to dirty her up. He didn't like that sweet ballad she had done with Enrique or or even the Eurovision song. He wanted the hip hop, the rough and rowdy hip hop sound for her female vocals, and it would have worked, but I think he was intimidated by Alsou's father when they met in the Taj Mahal, and Alsou's father said, and correctly so, he goes, why am I even asking you to sign my daughter? I could buy this whole record company if I wanted to, and then you would have to sign her, So it was not a great meeting. And Lior, kind of disappeared after that, and that was our last best chance for Alsou in America. And I was pretty heartbroken because to this day I believe I let her down. I still think she was far more talented than the number of record sales we accomplished. We did sell records in the UK and Germany and France, but she clearly was someone that should have been selling records in America for sure.
It didn't help also that she was signed to Mercury in the UK, and after she was signed, all the people who signed her were let go or fired. New people came in, and as you know, when new people come in, they want their own art. They're not interested in who was signed before they got there, and that was the end of Alsou. And her father kind of blamed Lear for it, and of course it wasn't.
Lear didn't even know about it.
Yeah. So that didn't go over very well with their cause.
I mean, and so then you're looking for a new act that you can break internationally, and you see Julia Volkova and Lena Katina, otherwise known as
t.A.T.u.
That's right.
So, okay, so you see them on MTV, I believe. So you see them in a video.
Yes.
What did you see and what impressed you about them?
Well, I'm still determined to find my international breakthrough, right? I that's what's driving me as a record executive, and I'm looking everywhere. And I one night late, it was very late, and MTV in Russia was, Boris Zosimov had turned MTV Russia into one of the coolest, most avant-garde, cutting-edge MTV channels anywhere on earth. And Bill Rohde can confirm that. Boris would play videos that other MTV channels wouldn't. And then they would start to play them, He was way ahead with his vision, and he was personally approving every video too. So he took a very hands-on approach to, it was like the Emperor and the Gladiator, yes or no to a video. And if you're no, you're dead. If you're not on MTV at that time, you don't have a career, basically. So he had so much power. And so t.A.T.u. had this very controversial video where they're standing on one side of a fence and the community is on the other side, teachers, parents, people judging them, looking down on them. And they're two schoolgirls who are obviously in distress, and they look at the society on one side, and then they just embrace each other and kiss. And it's pouring rain, and there's nothing romantic or sexual about this. This is pure provocation. And that's what t.A.T.u. was. That's what the project was. It was meant to provoke. And it did. It certainly did. Because that, to see a video like that on air, first time ever, in a country where homosexuality had been a crime and gay propaganda still is a crime, it was risky for everybody. It was risky for them. It was risky for MTV. And so when I saw that and I heard the music, and the music was infectious. It was this amazing up-tempo beat that was so strong. And Julia's vocals were they were in Russian, but I could tell she had this dynamic voice that, my God, if she can sing in English, this is it, So I decided to pursue them. They were my next artist, and I signed them to Universal against the judgment of my staff again, who were very concerned about all the trouble we were going to get into. But I did something really smart. I turned to my radio promoter and I said, "What do you think?" And he said, "The song's a hit, David." So that's all I needed. When the radio guy is on board, you're on board as a record label. And so we signed them to Universal.
I mean, they were very young, weren't they?
Yeah.
What were they, 16 at the time?
Yes, yes. They had been child actors for years. They had performed on TV and different music acts. So they were not new to show business by any means.
So they weren't marionettes. They weren't naive and
no. They were professionals at that point, and they had auditioned with hundreds of others, but they were clearly the right duo for this act. Which the manager who put it all together, we write about it. He reminded me of Malcolm McLaren from the Sex Pistols. Just provoke, 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 whatever it takes to provoke. I think he was trying to see how far this new freedom in Russia could go. He was testing the boundaries, and a kiss like that on TV. And remember, that went across the country. In Russia, MTV is like a BBC One or BBC Two. I mean, it was a national channel. Everyone saw it, and it was extremely controversial.
I mean, provocation works on one side, but there needs to be a good song. There needs to be talent.
Sure.
If you talk about the Sex Pistols, and Fred, maybe you can come in here and say what you think about this. But if we look at the Sex Pistols and this appearance on the Bill Grundy show, where one of them, I think it was Steve Jones, who said an incredibly controversial word at the time, and the next day it was the filth and the fury, and they were massive headlines. But they had songs. They were part of a wave.
Sure.
They represented the underdog in society, and in a sense, this is the feeling you get from t.A.T.u. as well. How do you feel about this, Fred? How do you see that?
Well, I totally agree that if the music isn't there, then you have nothing. I mean, you can provoke, but without the talent to back it up, and t.A.T.u. had both. They were definitely, as David said, he recognized their talent immediately when they were singing in Russian, and the being provocative was just icing on the cake. There was he was having a meeting at Universal, as you read in the book, and the representative from Italy came in after there was a photo, in the papers about them kissing. Of course, did not go over well with the Vatican. And David thought the guy was going to come in and be angry, and the guy said, "You've made us a hit. We're selling records now because of this, but you have to have the musical talent."
Yeah, and you got the right producer, didn't you? I mean, you got the producer in a sense of the 80s. Frankie Goes to Hollywood, just all these amazing bands that Trevor Horn was involved with, and then there was one after the other event which seemed to propel them. Tell me about the Tonight Show, David.
I'll let Fred tell that story. He's actually a former NBC employee, so it really cuts close to home for him.
It's true. Yeah, I was a publicist at NBC. So it's the Tonight Show with Jay Leno, and they get booked, and they're in New York at the time, and David tells them, "Remember how the Beatles went on Ed Sullivan, and that made the Beatles in America? Well, this is going to be your Ed Sullivan. This is going to be a breakthrough for you in America, but you have to behave." And they said, "Of course we will, of course." And the show, so David has to go back to Moscow to meet with the U.S. ambassador. So they go to Burbank to do the Tonight Show starring Jay Leno, and they're told not to kiss. Of course they do, but the show cuts away. That wasn't a problem.
So they were already prepared for that. The show sort of realized that. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. The producers were smart enough to know, well, they're probably going to do it anyway, but we'll just cut to the guitars. So that wasn't seen on the air. However, the girls were wearing T-shirts, and just before they went out, with Sharpies, they wrote something on their shirts in Russian. And of course, nobody at NBC, knew what the Russian meant. They probably should have investigated that. So, can I say this on the air?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a podcast.
Okay. So what it said was, "Fuck the war." the war in Iraq.
Iraq. This is when the Iraq war is
Yeah.
starting to go bad for the U.S.
But it's in Russian, so nobody.
Yeah.
The problem was there were Russians in America watching the Tonight Show, and they flooded the NBC switchboard with, "You just put an obscenity in the air." The F word in America. You can say it on streaming now, but you cannot say it on broadcast television. That results in a huge fine from the Federal Communications Commission, and that's happened before. So it was a problem. So NBC, when they learned what they had put on the air, banned tATu from ever being on the network again. And the next night they went on Jimmy Kimmel on ABC with the same shirts. And they kissed on the air, and that was all. It all helped to sell records.
All these things are very entertaining in retrospect because they don't seem a big deal later on, do they? You know what I mean? But I remember when I started with MTV, there was a meeting, "Can I be gay?" at MTV. Right. I mean, it was 1987. It's completely mad if you think about that today. And in a similar way, all these, a swear word and so on and so forth is no big deal, it feels like, today.
So one of my best friends at NBC was the head of broadcast standards. And what I learned from him was it's ever changing. When I worked at NBC, you could not say the word bitch on television. And then there came a moment where they allowed it. Also, time of day is important. You can say things on Saturday Night Live at 11:30 that you could not say in prime time. There were things you could do in prime time that you couldn't do on morning television. So it's an ever-changing, way back in 1967, they ended a Star Trek episode where Captain Kirk says, "Let's get the hell out of here." Well, hell was not a word you heard on NBC. That was considered a huge swear word. And look where we're at today. So yeah, broadcast standards is ever evolving.
Now, one thing that you did, which was, I must have actually changed the whole music business at the time, David, is setting up this trade organization. How did you do that, and what was the purpose of it? The NFPP, I think it is.
So one of my jobs as the CEO of Universal in Russia was to fight piracy, defend the rights of Elton John and Bon Jovi and Mariah Carey. and I was asked, since Universal was the largest record company, not just in the world, but also in Russia too. We were the largest, and me being the only American working in the music industry there, a lot kind of fell on me to do because no one else would. And this was one of the things that we needed to do. We needed to come together as a record industry, all the different record companies, the big ones like us, Universal and Warner and Sony, but also the smaller ones and the Russian ones. And that's a rowdy group of people. That's a really rowdy group. I compare it we write about it in the book, how it's like when that scene in The Godfather, when Don Corleone gathers the families and tries to make peace. So, no one, that's what we did. That's what we had to do. And no one wanted the job. I got elected the first chairman by default because literally no one else wanted to do this job. And and one of the great honors of being the leader of the group to fight piracy is you have to go out on these police raids and fight piracy. So I'd be strapping on bulletproof vests and helmets and going on raids of pirate factories, and then I'd have to go to court and testify against these pirates, to prove that no, we own the rights to Elton John, not Ivan Ivanovich. That's not how it works. And so it was, a really important step for the development of the music industry, because we also were able to get Russia to sign the treaties on songwriters protection, intellectual property, all those things that you need for a normal functioning music industry. You can't have a music industry if you don't have protections like that. And Russia, when I got there, had none. So this local group had to make it happen.
I mean, that's a really brave thing to do, because you mentioned earlier on about the pirates and what they funded. I mean, they funded immense criminality. So if I put those two things together, I think there must have been a price on your head.
You know, I know that, like I said, I do know a few people that were killed, but they were Russians and they were gangsters. I mean, they were involved in that world. Maybe it was too much paperwork. If you kill an American, you gotta, it's an international bureaucratic problem. I don't know. I know I was followed. I've been told I was always followed while I was there. But at the end of the day, uh, there was bigger things to steal than music. And I do think probably if I'd been working in some other industries like finance or aluminum or oil or steel, it would have been more dangerous.
I don't want to go through every story, but just want to sort of mention that also in the book are stories of when Mariah Carey came over, Marilyn Manson, obviously, a controversial artist, particularly, I would have thought in Russia, Rammstein, which is, the German band. And I'm sure they were incredibly controversial at that time as well. And you tell the stories of them. You also talk about Troika, who became Smash, which you mentioned earlier, with Simon Napier-Bell, which was about sort of recreating Wham, who Simon was, of course, a manager of, and took them to China many years ago, the first band in China. Now, one of the most fascinating things about any biography and any story about someone's life is not always what's in them, but what isn't in them. It's like, what do I leave out? Because maybe this is a bit too tough to put in. Were there stories that you can't touch?
Well, I left a lot of names out of individuals that I worked with in Russia for their own safety. A lot of them are still working in the music industry in Russia. And I could have certainly talked more specifically about those individuals in the book. I think I left a lot of that out. I do think I didn't talk enough about my home life there. I really, I have some positive stories about Russia too. I tell some, but there were many great moments for me. I really made my career in Russia, and I owe that country a lot. And I had a country home on the Volga River. I mean, it's something just I was very fortunate, and I was on. I was interviewed a lot in Russia. I was on TV a lot. I was an expert on the music industry while I was there, and that's something I could never duplicate that here in Los Angeles, for example. But there I was the go-to person, and that was a great thrill for me. So if anything, I think I left out more positive stories about Russia because I do want to highlight what a tragedy it is for me to see Russia invading Ukraine and just generally washing away a lot of what we did in the West to help Russia after the end of the Cold War. So many of those bridges have been burned and maybe for generations. And that's what's really the tragedy, because I saw Russia when it was full of hope and potential and, in partnership with America. And we are so far from that right now.
I mean, you mentioned earlier on about the trigger, the Roger Waters, being a fan of Pink Floyd, Roger Waters, the Wall concert in Berlin, going there, meeting these Eastern Europeans, and then finding out what you wanted to do in life and eventually going to be the CEO of PolyGram. What eventually changed your mind about living there?
Easy. Terrorism. I experienced living in Russia more terrorism than you can imagine. It was there were two wars in Chechnya while I was there, and that created a major pushback from the folks in the Caucasus. In particular, the wives of Chechen soldiers who were murdered or killed in the wars became what they call Black Widows, and they came to Moscow to create havoc and blow up train stations and airports. And so it was getting more and more frightening. You know, I never really worried about the gangsters, the corrupt Kremlin people, the even the police. You know, I figured out who you have to bribe and who you can just keep on driving. You know, I figured the system out, but the nonstop terrorism, and most importantly, the Russian security services inability to do anything about it, to protect, to even rescue hostages. I lived through two of the most horrific hostage taking events in the history of terrorism. The theater in Moscow called Dubrovka, where I thought maybe my family was watching the play that night. I frantically called when I saw it on TV and realized that several hundred people were held hostage in this theater, showcasing a play, a musical similar to Les Miserables, but the Soviet version of that. I was worried, my family was in there. They weren't, thank God. And then another terrible incident happened on the first day of school in Russia, September 1st, when a school in the village of Beslan in the Caucasus, that's south of Moscow, a few hundred miles south of Moscow. That entire school was taken hostage, 900 kids and teachers and parents by these terrorists. And the Russians never even tried to rescue them. It was more of a, let's kill all the hostages and then see who's left over. And they brought in tanks and attack helicopters to a hostage rescue operation. And I watched it on live TV, and my heart just broke, and that was my breaking point. And I moved my family back to the U.S. after that. I followed a year later. I had to finish my contract with Universal, but that's what broke me. That's what made me leave the first time I left.
Well, I'd like to thank both of you, Fred Bronson and David Junk. The book is amazing. It's really fascinating, and as I said before, it brought back real memories for me of this side to Russia that was always a good story, but always a bit scary as well. And so I thank you for that. The book's called Rockin the Kremlin, My Incredible True Story of Gangsters, Oligarchs, and Pop Stars in Putin's Russia. Thank you both.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the great questions. Really appreciate it.
It was a lot of fun. Really enjoyed it.
Up there is an interview I recommend. Down there is where you can find all the podcast interviews. And here is where you can connect.